In a not-so-distant future, humanity has conquered interstellar travel, building enormous ships capable of carrying thousands of passengers to new worlds. Among the immensity of space, the Avalon travels silently toward Homestead 2, a promised planet meant to be the beginning of a new life. But an accident will change everything. When a man awakens 90 years earlier than expected and realizes he is doomed to live alone on a ship designed for thousands of sleeping people. Loneliness, despair, and an unexpected companion will lead him to face moral dilemmas and dangers that will put at stake not only his life, but the future of the mission. So today we will see a movie called Passengers. The interstellar spaceship Avalon can be seen traveling through space, headed toward a colonized world called Homestead 2. All of its compartments are empty. The vessel is on autopilot. The 258 crew members, as well as the 5,000 passengers, are in hibernation. Suddenly, the ship passes through an asteroid belt that weakens its shields. Power is diverted to the main shield, but the ship ends up on a collision course with a massive asteroid. The asteroid collides with the Avalon, causing several malfunctions. The ship begins self-repairs, but one of the hibernation pods activates. The passenger who wakes up is Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer. His pod opens, and an automated system assists him in the awakening process, informing him that he has spent 120 years in suspended animation and that the ship is only 4 months away from Homestead 2. He is told he will be able to spend that time enjoying the luxurious aspects of the ship. Jim receives instructions about his ID band, his cabin, and the primary activities he must take part in before arriving at the planet. Excited and nervous to meet the people on the ship, he gets ready, leaves his cabin, and enters an automated class designed for a whole group of learners. Jim looks a little anxious as the hologram explains the situation on Earth, describing it as overpopulated, overpriced, and overrated. The hologram tells him to hold his questions until the end of the lesson, but Jim insists on asking why he is the only one there. He realizes that the hologram cannot answer him and decides to search for other people. Jim reaches the ship's main concourse. There is no one there either, but an automated information desk offers him help. Jim asks to speak to a real person, and the system directs him to a steward. But when he arrives, he discovers no one is there either. Then he asks to see the captain. When he reaches the bridge, even though he has no access to go inside, he can see that none of the main crew members are awake either. Finally, Jim goes to the observatory, where he discovers that the ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead 2. He realizes he woke up far too early, so he rushes back to the concourse and sends a message to Earth asking what he should do, since he has no idea how to return to hibernation. The communications system informs him that the extremely expensive transmission would take approximately 55 years to get an answer. Jim is devastated. He wanders through the ship and finds the bar where he sees another person. As he speaks with the bartender, something about him seems strange. When the bartender goes to pour him a drink, Jim realizes he is an android. His name is Arthur. Jim wants to find out more information from him, but he cannot even explain to the android how it is possible for him to be awake ahead of time. The next day, Jim wakes up in his cabin and heads to the cafeteria, where he quickly realizes that most items on the menu are reserved for gold-class passengers only. He settles for a plain coffee and begins thinking about how to repair his hibernation pod. He gathers all the necessary tools, manages to get the system running again, and lies down inside the capsule. However, nothing happens. He then decides to use the tools to try to access the crew's hibernation chambers, but that does not work either. Meanwhile, small malfunctions begin occurring throughout the ship. Jim keeps returning to the bar to drink, but mostly to talk to Arthur. The android gives him some advice that convinces him to break into one of the gold-class rooms and try to enjoy himself on the ship. Jim tries out the restaurants, the games, the entertainment system. But as time goes by, he becomes more and more miserable being there alone. One day, he gets drunk and wanders among the hibernation pods until he stumbles into an airlock equipped with spacesuits for spacewalks. Jim puts on one of the suits, enters the airlock, pulls the lever, and presses the button that releases the door. Once outside the ship, he is mesmerized by the view. He is the only conscious human being experiencing that moment. He releases the magnets on his boots and floats in space, feeling devastated. He comes back inside, takes off the suit, but then returns to the airlock without it on. He pulls the lever, ready to end it all, but at the last instant changes his mind, runs back inside and slips on a bottle. Jim stands up and is instantly captivated by a woman in one of the pods, named Aurora. He searches her files in the directory and listens to her passenger interview, becoming infatuated with her. Later, he is seen sitting next to her pod, still listening to her interviews. Back at the bar, Jim reads some of her work and talks to Arthur about her writing. He becomes obsessed with the irony of his situation, traveling to another planet in search of a better life, waking up too soon and not making it, and finding the perfect woman only for her to be out of reach. Jim keeps thinking about her and starts contemplating the idea of waking her up as well. He discusses his dilemma with the android, but Arthur does not understand the gravity of the situation. If he wakes her up for his own benefit, he would be dooming her to be stranded with him on the ship until death. At first, Jim decides against it, but as time passes, he cannot let go of the idea. Until one day, he changes his mind. He goes to her pod and manages to activate it. As she wakes up and goes through the same process he did, Jim hides and returns to his room. A little later, he goes to the main concourse hoping to find her. And there she is, just as confused as he was a year before. Jim tells her they are the only ones awake and takes her to the observatory. Then he explains that he cannot access either the crew or the main commands of the ship. Aurora panics and wants to get back into her pod. When they reach it, Jim explains that there is no special equipment on the ship that can help them return to hibernation, effectively telling her that they are stranded. They return to the concourse and he advises her to rest, since she has just come out of hibernation. She feels sorry for him, having spent more than a year alone on the ship. Jim goes back to the bar, regretful of what he has done. He asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that he was the one who woke her up. The next day, Aurora wakes up. She goes back to the concourse and asks the automated information desk about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her there and they go to breakfast together. As they leave, the information desk has some sort of malfunction. In the cafeteria, Aurora realizes that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for more than a year and gets him one of the gold-class meals. They talk about the possibility of fixing the pods, but unlike Jim, Aurora is not ready to give up. She searches through the infirmary, then looks into research documents, and eventually ends up at the crew's hibernation quarters trying to break the doors open. Jim notices more malfunctions happening throughout the ship. Sometime later, Aurora laments her life on the Avalon. She writes, jogs around the ship, and swims in the pool, becoming more and more aware of her situation. She goes to the cafeteria to interview Jim, thinking his story might be interesting. She asks why he emigrated to the colony. Jim first answers with the company's slogans, but then further explains that he hoped that on the new world he could be somebody, that he could build a life. Later, they end up in the observatory and Aurora finally shares her own reason for being there. Unlike the other passengers on the ship, Aurora has a round-trip ticket. Her plan was to travel to Homestead 2, live there for a year, and then return to Earth to become the first journalist ever to do so, writing the greatest story ever told. Little by little, Aurora begins to give up on finding a solution to their predicament, and Jim looks for ways to cheer her up. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to the basketball court. Finally, he brings her to the bar to introduce her to Arthur. She relaxes for a moment until she remembers their situation. Jim is left alone with the android, feeling guilty about what he has done to her. Later, he is seen working on something, and afterward, Aurora walks into the observatory to find a miniature model of the Chrysler building he has made for her. Sometime later, they go on a date at the bar. They have dinner and share stories about their lives. She tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After dinner, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock and both put on spacesuits. They go out for a spacewalk together. Jim finally has someone to share that magnificent experience with. He switches off the magnets on their boots and they float together in space. When they return inside, they immediately kiss, retreat to his cabin, and sleep together. Soon after, they begin living as a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin and writes about her life on the ship. They jog together, eat together, sleep together. Jim explores the ship further and finds the hydroponics bay. He brings Aurora flowers. One day, the Avalon passes near a red giant star and they go to the observatory to see it. It is Aurora's birthday, so that night they celebrate in one of the many restaurants on the ship and then at the bar. Jim goes to the restroom and prepares the ring he made for Aurora, while she stays chatting with Arthur. The android accidentally reveals that Jim woke her up on purpose, unaware that it was meant to be a secret. Suddenly, Jim returns and Aurora confronts him in absolute disbelief. She runs away furious and panicked. Jim goes back to his cabin and finds that all of her belongings are gone. The next day, he sees her in the cafeteria, but the moment he tries to talk to her, she runs off. Aurora is desperate. One night, she goes to Jim's cabin, punching and kicking him, trying to kill him. Since she keeps avoiding him, Jim tries to apologize and explain himself over the communication system. He tells her that he fell in love with her, but Aurora does not care. She cannot forgive him for taking her life away. One night, while Jim is in his cabin, another malfunction occurs. The ship faces a critical error and the main command shuts down. Later, he enters the elevator and it also malfunctions. Aurora goes to the concourse and sees that Jim has planted a tree there. Then she goes to the cafeteria where the food dispenser is also failing. Suddenly, both hear the voice of the deck chief over the comms, asking who planted the tree. They run to the concourse and see Gus Mancuso standing in front of Jim's tree. They introduce themselves and explain the situation. The chief cannot understand how 3 pods could fail. Mancuso takes them to the bridge and discovers that something is wrong with the ship, but the systems have to be checked manually. When they leave the bridge, a robot nearly falls on their heads, and they tell him that malfunctions have been happening more and more often. He says that should not be possible and shows them how to collect the data. Mancuso checks the pods, and Jim joins him. He has figured out what happened with Aurora's pod. The deck chief considers what Jim did to be terrible. Later, he is at the bridge reviewing the data when Aurora joins him. They talk about what happened with her pod, but he tells her there is nothing that can be done. Jim walks in carrying the 16th broken robot. Mancuso begins to feel the effects of hibernation sickness, so he goes to rest. But as he leaves, he coughs up blood. That night, Aurora cannot sleep and goes swimming. Suddenly, there is a gravity failure throughout the ship, and she begins to drown as the water from the pool lifts with her. The gravity drive resets, and she barely escapes alive. She then runs into Jim as they both go looking for Mancuso. The 3 of them return to the bridge, slowly uncovering what has been happening to the ship. Mancuso concludes that something happened 2 years ago that disabled a major system. They must find and repair the cause of the failure, because the entire ship is struggling to compensate. If they do not fix it, the Avalon will be doomed. They go to find the problem, but Mancuso collapses, so Jim and Aurora carry him to the infirmary. He is dying, and there is no treatment that can save or even prolong his life. Sometime later, the 3 of them meet in the observatory, and Mancuso gives Jim his ID bracelet, telling them to fix the ship before dying immediately. Suddenly, the lights turn an alarming red, and the ship begins shaking. Jim tells Aurora he needs her help, and they run toward engineering. But another gravity failure occurs. Immediately afterward, Arthur is also affected. Jim deactivates him. They finally reach engineering and begin searching for the problem. They find it in the power plant, and when they open the hatch, Aurora is sucked outside. The asteroid had caused a breach in the hull in that section. Jim is also pulled out but manages to hold on to the hatch as it closes on him. Eventually, he too is sucked out, but together they manage to seal the breach. Immediately after solving that issue, Jim realizes there is more than one fracture in the hull. They follow the meteor's trajectory and discover that it struck the reactor control computer. Jim believes he can find replacement parts. They retrieve and install them, but the reactor venting process fails. They attempt it manually, but it fails again. Jim realizes he must open the vent door from outside the ship to cool the reactor. Both of them head to the airlock, and as Jim prepares to go out, he gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet, since he may not come back. She helps him into the suit, and as he enters the airlock, she begs him to return because she cannot live on the ship without him. Aurora goes back to the reactor where the temperature has reached critical levels. A bolt from the reactor hits her arm while Jim approaches the vent door from the outside and sees it. The temperature continues to rise in the reactor room while he tries to force the vent open. He soon realizes he must hold it open manually so the reactor can vent, and he tells Aurora. She disagrees with the plan, but he insists and tells her to release the vent. She does not want him to die, and they argue, but Jim reminds her they must save the others. Aurora vents the reactor. The process succeeds, but the gases push Jim away into space and break his tether. The pressure in his suit begins to drop. He tells Aurora what has happened, and she rushes to get another suit to rescue him. Jim apologizes once more. She puts on a suit and flies out to him, but her tether is too short and pulls her back. Suddenly, she manages to grab Jim's tether and pull him inside. Aurora drags Jim into the infirmary only to discover he is already dead. She uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and resuscitate him. The medical pod acts automatically and revives Jim. Aurora forgives him. Later, Aurora repairs Arthur, and together they give Mancuso a proper space burial. Jim takes Aurora to the infirmary and tells her he has found a way to use the medical pod as a hibernation chamber. He asks her to get inside and spend the rest of the journey asleep. But, as later revealed, she declines and decides to stay with him, awake on the ship. Finally, Jim proposes to her, and they live out the rest of their lives together aboard the Avalon. 88 years later, the ship arrives at Homestead 2. The crew awakens and finds the vessel in a very unexpected state. Aurora leaves them a message, recounting the story of the life she and Jim shared on the ship while everyone else slept. I hope you enjoyed the video.